the door to stay open or shut?
Shut.
Yeah, let's close it for now.
Excuse me.
This room gets very warm sometimes, so
We can crack it open if you get hot.
I knew I was making people cold. I'm sorry. I indulged myself because I was enjoying the air so much.
Yeah.
No rush, you're early. We were just very early, so actually, while Professor Wong sets up, I'll just continue with this. Twombly played an equally significant role along with Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns in opening pathways beyond the high-minded purity and frequent machismo of abstract expressionism, the dominant painting style in the late 1940s and 50s. In different ways, each artist countered the Olympian loftiness of the abstract expressionists, and this is the notion of the artist as genius, right? By stressing the loquacious, that is talkative, cosmopolitan nature of art and its connectedness not only to other forms of culture, but also to the volatile machinations of the human mind and to lived experience. Rauschenberg's art function, well, let's see, I'll skip that part. But the point is this shift from this notion of art as this high-minded, pure work of genius to this notion of the loquacious, the cosmopolitan, art as conversation, and art also as connected with lived experience rather than something that's outside it. I just thought it was interesting to see in the New York Times the same kind of paradigm that we've been dealing with. So that's the end of that. Yes, absolutely. We're still early.
How do you relate that to modernism?
Well, I see the abstract expressionists as the last gasp of heroic modernism. And that next generation is the ones who more thoroughly make the transition toward the postmodern.
How do you spell the first name? Twombly, the first name?
Psy, C-Y. He's a very cerebral painter, I think, but there's one really nice illustration of his work in here, I think. But I don't know whether this would mean anything or not. It's a kind of work I like. Sort of see it. It's very abstract, but it's a little different from the abstract expressionists in the way he makes his marks and shapes the canvas. If any of you want to look at it later, I'll show it to you. Twombly was also quite famous for doing paintings that look like writing, but they're not alphabetical. Some of them look like scribbles on a chalkboard. Those I never got. And in fact, my late wife despised them. She was always annoyed by those. But yes. Yeah. Thanks, Jen. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I've already told them that no one in the world knows as much about this book, except maybe Maxine Hong Kingsley. So,
I know more, authors don't read it.
yeah, I agree.
But we can contribute to the conversation.
You can. Yes. You can indeed, but you don't get the last word. because no one does. Okay, good. Well, then I think we will just proceed. You don't want to do shoot, Mike?
You know, I need the outlook for that. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My voice actually doesn't carry very well, so, you know, if you can't hear me, I actually have a portable mic, but then I have to move to a place where I can talk again. So if you, is it okay?
Yes.
How have we done that in the past?
It worked here. I think we got an extension cord.
Oh, okay.
We could try that if you
Yeah.
want to do that. Is
Yeah, I'm
that,
sure there's some various thing.
yeah.
It's a
Oh, yeah, this is gonna work.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Well, see, that's the problem. We don't have to plug it. We need the other one.
Well, no, okay, well, we'll find a plug, hold on.
Yeah.
I thought you had one behind you.
I don't think there is one in that wall. That's the exterior
Did you
wall.
guys have a one behind you?
No.
Better?
Yeah.
Better?
Yes.
Okay.
A
All
bit
right.
some more.
Yeah.
We are getting a little buzz.
I'm sorry, I don't know where is the bus coming from.
Turn it maybe down just a
Just
little.
turn it down just a little, I
Okay, how about this?
think. Good? Yeah.
Okay, well, let's give it a try.
Yes. And just wave if it gets hard to hear.
Yeah. Okay.
I should mention that Professor Wong is one of our, as of today, will be one of the 10-year veterans of this program. She has spoken to each of our groups, and each year her presentation gets richer and deeper and more interesting.
There's still a hum.
Yeah.
Is it interacting with anything here?
I think if you just set it up on the thing a little bit and then just turn it down a tad, it'll be cool.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, how about this?
Yeah, that's good. Now it's working.
Ah, okay. All right, great. Okay. Has it been 10 years?
10 years. 10 years, approximately, about 175 participants in the 10-year period.
Great. So I'm very honored to be here again. Do we have time to just do a quick round of
Sure.
introductions?
Yes.
Yeah, I will try to match this again, so this is Tom said me, but, you know, I don't think I can learn your names right away, if you don't mind. Yeah.
My name is Anaki.
Uh-huh.
I'm from Kyrgyzstan.
Oh,
My name is Kana. I'm from Nigeria.
I'm Saleh from Iraq.
I'm Wajun Chan from China.
Karim, Tunisian.
Sabino from the Dominican Republic.
Sanjay from India.
Irina from Belarus.
Brian from the moon.
Singa from Mongolia.
Sindhu from the Ivory Coast. Veyu from Cameroon.
Rashad from Yemen.
Castelli from Angola.
Maria from Slovakia.
Julia from Ukraine. Rabia from Pakistan.
Gladys from Madagascar.
Sonia from El Salvador.
I want to preface my presentation by explaining why I'm keeping my cell phone on the table. we had some miscommunication scheduling, so right now, actually, my summer session class is going on, and they are watching a DVD, and there's going to be a guest speaker, but I'm keeping this on vibrate, so that if there's any problem, they can call me. So if I suddenly, pick up the phone, excuse me, but there may be a problem there. So.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, I was going to show the DVD anyways.
Okay.
And the guest speaker, my former student, so she is subbing for me, very lucky. Yeah. In fact, in that class, I just finished teaching this battle hymn of the Tiger Mother by by a Chinese American woman, and it's a bestseller. It's caused a lot of controversy. I don't know if you've all heard about it. Now, this is a very different kind of book. It's a memoir, not in the literary mode. It's about her experiences raising two daughters according to the so-called Tiger method. And it's been very controversial. But it just kind of occurred to me, it's like, oh, okay, another woman warrior. There's a battle hymn of the Tiger Mother. It's like filled with imagery of warfare. And she kind of goes to battle on behalf of her beliefs as a parent, and also, I guess, on behalf of excellence, to raise these high-achieving daughters. So, okay, like another example of a Chinese-American woman somehow capturing the public imagination and, making the reading public feel, oh, okay, we have something to learn, to this warrior woman, But anyway, it's been decades since The Woman Warrior was published. It first came out in 1976, right? And so it has very good staying power. Okay? For a long time, it enjoyed actually both popular success and also critical and academic acclaim. One measure you can use is like to go to airport bookstores and see where the book is on the shelf. So actually for many years, The Woman Warrior was a staple. I think I still see it, but not as much. And then of course, like some years after it appeared, Amy Tan's The Joy of Cup became like a huge bestseller. And I see more of Amy Tan's books, at airport bookstores. So I think in terms of that kind of popular readership, The Woman Warrior has faded a little bit, but on the other hand, what is done, to gain a foothold in the academy, right, in the critical establishment, is something that the General Public never really achieved. Okay. Another thing to notice that both of them have become international world texts. So it's not just limited. And so in my presentation, I'd like to kind of step back and take a look at The Woman Warrior's canonized status, which is very assured now, okay? But I am old enough, when it first came out, it was still kind of like a novelty and people didn't know what to do with it, and it came as a surprise and so on. So I would really like to emphasize kind of the historical process. I want to situate the text historically. And then now that the world has changed so much since 1976, I want to raise a question as to whether it's still a good kind of quote representative text for Chinese American literature and Asian American literature. So in some ways, right, it came out of a specific historical moment, or rather success, can be accounted for by specific historical forces, and those forces have obviously changed over the years. So I would like to take a look at that. Okay, The Woman Warrior has been read in many, many different ways. I'll start with the US and I'll talk about, another country, China, and then just touch on general issues about its status as a world text. But I want to look at it as an ethnic text, okay, and as a feminist text, and then as a postmodernist text with certain types of formal features, and then as a national American text, and then finally as an international or transnational, if you will, or world text. So at this point, of course, you are studying it as kind of sort of fait accompli. It is it's an integral part of contemporary American literature. Okay? So that is not disputable, right? And also, you probably have taught it already, or studied it or read it in your own country. So to that extent, it has, its influence has spread all over the world. I'd like to look at how kind of different, the book's different roles, okay, or if you will, like reading frames or interpretive frames or critical and pedagogical practices actually interact with each other. Of course, when you're studying as a scholar, you have to have a focus. You have to single it out, as a particular kind of text. But because the Woman Warriors have simultaneously all these things, I am curious to see how these kind of impact on each other. And I think sometimes you see a sort of synergy. They actually kind of reinforce each other. And then sometimes you see them conflicting or subverting each other, conflicting with or subverting each other. I actually firmly believe that there's no kind of universal or common reading, across different reading positions. Okay, so if you have different critical practices or pedagogical practices, each one tends to claim a book in its own way. Okay, so to give it a particular kind of angle, or use different theory to interpret it, or teach it in certain ways, right? And all these are influenced by one's institutional position as well. So I'll start out with actually myself as an example. Okay, I just retired last year, but for many years I taught in the Asian American Studies program in the Ethnic Studies department here at UC Berkeley. And you probably know something about the history of that. Prior to the late 1960s, no such thing as ethnic studies existed. Okay, the whole field actually resulted from confrontation, from political activism, from student demonstrations, strikes, and so on. And then eventually an institutional location was carved out so that there came to be such a thing called Asian American Studies, which is considered like a subset of ethnic studies. But my own training was actually in very traditional British and American literature, because at that time, no such field existed, right, when I was getting my PhD. So I just happened to have been hired in ethnic studies. I could also have been hired in an English department. But because of my institutional location, and then interacting with my own temperament, my own political beliefs, right, and my material interest, is my livelihood. I ended up doing my criticism in a particular way, which is often different from the way my English department colleagues do criticism on the Woman Warrior, or my women's studies colleagues. And so I was look at some controversies coming out of these kind of conflicts between different practices, starting with the ethnic part. Okay, so I'll look at it first as an ethnic text. Now, there's a long tradition in American literature of ethnic texts gaining a lot of public attention, and then for people in that generation becoming paradigmatic in some way of the American experience. So it could either be confirming, right, of certain hegemonic myths about America, or it could be challenging such myths. In any case, you know, the idea that America is a nation made up of immigrants and their descendants, and of course, except for Native Americans. This is persistent, right? Periodically, you have writers who are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants talking about their non-mainstream experiences, and this will compel like a kind of re-evaluation, rethinking about what it means to be American, right? How has the American character changed? Right? What is the future of this country, and so on and so forth. So the Woman Warrior actually fits into that very well. But the reason why it got as big as it was, I mean, one of the reasons is actually it came out of a specific historical moment. Okay, so in the late 60s and early 70s, of course, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, all these things are going on. The Black Power movement actually led Asian Americans to kind of formulate their own yellow power. Okay, so that was also happening. Like I mentioned, ethnic studies movement happened. Okay, so it wasn't until 1969 that ethnic studies courses began to be read, right? And then the feminist movement, second wave feminism was going on. Now, at the same time, from the kind of formal end, you know, and this is actually Tom your specialty. Okay? So there are other texts that, you know, would be classified as postmodernist, you know, coming out. So you have a kind of like convergence of different forces, you know, different political movements, right, different cultural strands and so on. As an ethnic text, it has positive effects for the Chinese American community because it makes the Chinese American experience quote unquote speakable. So for a long time, you know, there was really just no discursive space for a Chinese American woman, you know, to write about the kind of things that Kingston did. Now, that said, I want to qualify my statement by saying back in the 1940s, there actually was a very successful Chinese American women's text called Fifth Chinese Daughter by Jade Snow Wong, which actually also became a bestseller. And it was so successful that the American State Department sent the author on a tour to Asia. However, there are a lot of very interesting differences between the two. And then between the 40s and the 70s, of course, this was the Cold War period. Okay, so there were factors too why a lot of Asian Americans felt that they really could not break into literary creation and publishing. So there's one positive effect. I think now it's difficult to imagine a time when Chinese Americans felt very, very oppressed. Okay? Times have definitely changed for a number of different reasons. But less than 10 years before the Woman Warrior came out, there were no Chinese American history courses taught anywhere in the United States. Okay? So the pioneers in this field, they actually had to write an outline syllabus, just to list all the things that were kind of forgotten or suppressed, in the teaching of American history. And that's pretty recent, right? But now, of course, Chinese Americans have gained in numbers to a certain point, but also visibility, right, influence, and then the geopolitics of the whole world, has actually changed too. So there's a difference between the status of Chinese Americans now and then the Chinese Americans back in the 40s and then also in the 60s. Okay, the Woman Warrior was very inspiring for a lot of Asian American women, especially people who wanted to write. So it made them feel that it's possible to write and to publish and to be heard. And of course, overall, regardless of gender, the success of the book actually brought visibility, right, to the Chinese American community, and then a certain amount of recognition. Now, whether this kind of recognition is a good thing is debatable, okay, or people have debated about it. So on the negative side, the very success of the Woman Warrior actually made it suspect. Okay? And this seems to be the fate of a lot of so-called ethnic texts that became successful. The reasoning is that if it sells so well, there must be something wrong with it. Okay, right? And there have been a lot of voices raised against the Woman Warrior. The most vocal controversies took place in the 70s and 80s. Sometimes people call it the Frank Chin Maxine Hong-Kingston debate, but Frank Chin, is a male Chinese American writer. Also from around the same period. I think actually for a while they were friends. And then Frank Chin started publishing a lot of attacks on the Woman Warrior. Kingston herself actually never got into the fray. It's other people jumping into the fray. And I jumped into it a little bit too. Okay. But Frank Chin kind of represented a voice that can be described as cultural nationalist. And there were women in that camp, but mostly men, and they have very well spelled out premises from which they attacked the Woman Warrior. So the cultural project that's central to cultural nationalism is to quote-unquote claim America, which is to assert the presence of Asian Americans in the history and of this country, and also in contemporary America, to emphasize that they have been here for a long time. They have been an integral part of the nation's life, and especially made a lot of contributions to the building and the development of the United States. So to that extent, they should be recognized. The cultural nationalists also believed, following from that, okay, there's actually an emphasis on American-born writers and also Anglophone writers. In fact, looking back now, okay, this seems to be a kind of nervousness. People were very almost paranoid about being associated with your Asian country of origin because of the Cold War mentality. Okay, so they would try to distance themselves from so-called like Asian writers. So if you're Chinese American, say I'm Chinese American. Okay, I'm not Chinese. And this is actually one of the founding principles of Asian American studies too, right? We're not Asian studies, which people are always mistaking us for, but we're Asian American studies. And they're actually very insistent on this point because there were real historical consequences when you mix up the Asian and the Asian American. So one, egregious example, okay, would be Japanese Americans, including those born in this country, racist citizens and very patriotic toward America, having been put in concentration camps during the Second World War. Okay, so they were basically treated as enemy aliens and not as, American citizens of Japanese descent. So there's a historical reason for that. But in any case, then one of the premises of cultural nationalism is that we're not looking at people who are, say, Chinese speaking or who write in Chinese. We're just looking at works produced by American-born Chinese writing in English, because that's where they can actually gain recognition, right? There's also an emphasis on working class background because the earliest Asian immigrants came here as laborers. And so to counteract this long history of discrimination, of exclusion, right, the cultural nationalists wanted to emphasize a heroic tradition. They would reclaim their ancestors whose labors were forgotten, right, or despised, and turn them into heroic figures. And then in connection with that, because the early Asian immigrants were isolated in these ethnic enclaves, there's a valorization of the kind of geographical community. Okay? Now, if you think about it, the idea of Asian American, which is an umbrella term covering Asians of different groups, that's kind of a virtual community. It's not an actual physical community. It can't be, okay? Because you have Asians of different backgrounds. But when you focus on specific ancestors and their histories and so on, then you can actually locate the community. And at the time, those communities tended to be concentrated, not spread out. Again, this has changed a lot, okay? So I think for at least the last quarter century, you've had increasingly different patterns of immigration from Asia. So for example, you'd have middle-class people coming and settling directly into the suburbs and bypassing things like Little Tokyo or Manila Town or Chinatown, So that is a very different picture. But at the time, this was almost kind of a sacred idea of community, right? And then two more very important tenets. One is anti-Orientalism, okay, and one is anti-racism. So with regard to anti-Orientalism, the very term Asian American was actually invented in order to counter the term Oriental. Okay? And so even nowadays, if you come across somebody saying, oh, an Oriental, you know that this is somebody who is still using the vocabulary and the concepts from an earlier period. Okay? Because the term Oriental has accumulated a lot of very negative connotations. And so you can't just be objectively denoted as an Oriental without carrying all this cultural baggage of the negative connotations. Right? So that's what the whole Orientalism idea is about. And so the term Asian Americans was invented, during this period. So as you can see, this actually ties in with the emphasis on claiming America too. Because if you draw, for example, from features from your ancestral culture, that would be immediately suspect. Okay? You think there would be a problem right away because people would begin applying these Orientalist images and stereotypes to you. And then the anti-racism, is kind of self-explanatory, but what form should it take? Okay? In the cultural realm, especially, okay, what does an anti-racist text look like? Okay, So if you look at this list and then you look at the woman warrior, okay, the book actually passes muster on many counts, right? So you have the heroic ancestors, you have Stockton Chinatown as the community, right? And you have the American Nativity, you have the Anglophone writing, you have the working class with the laundry workers and so on. Where it gets into trouble with the critics is about Orientalism and about racism. Okay? So many Asian American critics actually accuse the book of self-orientalization, okay? Whether conscious or subconscious, and then also accuse it of being complicit with racism. Sometimes under the guise of criticizing racism, but actually being complicit. And ultimately, all these got boiled down to the issues of authenticity and of representativeness. Okay? So with regard to the Orientalism issue, there's some interesting examples, specific examples that came out in the early debates. Okay? One has to do with translations. So I don't know if you know, but Kingston herself is pretty weak in Chinese. Okay? And she actually admitted that she had to go to the library to do research in order to write The Woman Warrior. But she also said, like, she got a lot of Chinese culture passed on to her by her mother, right, all the talk story stuff. And in the book, if you're somebody acquainted with Chinese culture, you'd find a lot of things that would set your teeth on edge, that would make you uncomfortable. You think, oh, this is wrong, So one small example is the translation of a term that you may have overlooked as just a little, reference. But she said at some point that a frog is a heavenly chicken, okay, heavenly chicken, and that's patently wrong. Okay, so it's actually in Cantonese tin gai, okay, which means field chicken. Field chicken meaning the frog meat is so tasty, it's like a chicken. Okay, but because Kingston herself is weak in Chinese, she got the tones wrong, and Chinese is a tone language. So you got the tone wrong, you actually get tin gai, which is heavenly chicken. And so for somebody who actually looks things up in the dictionary, if you just go by the spelling, you'll get that wrong. Now that's a relatively minor example, but the word ghost has actually just sparked a pretty explosive debate. Okay? So some of the cultural national critics said, okay, she titles, or rather the subtitle of the book is Memoir of the Girlhood Among Ghosts, right? So we can see ghosts is very important, the image of ghosts is very important. And there are these long passages about different types of ghosts, teacher ghosts, newspaper ghosts, and so on and so forth, right? And then you have this episode about haunting, the mother, in her dormitory, being sat on by this sitting ghost, right? And then her overcoming the sitting ghost and so on. And ghost is actually indeed a very common word in Cantonese. Okay? But the critics said this actually ghost has lost a lot of its ghostly meanings. And so in the case of speaking of a man as something ghost, it's almost like a dude, it's like, a guy, right? It's lost those connotations. And also, it could be devil, it could be demon, it could be like the dead coming back to life, it could be any number of different things. And so the accusation is that Kingston is playing up the otherness of Chinese Americans okay, by using ghost in the way that she uses it, and which they claim is kind of ignoring real usage of the term ghost in Cantonese. Okay? So you could actually debate about that. I think each historical age, translators from different nations, you know, who've got different backgrounds, would pick a certain range of meaning to translate the word ghost. Okay? And from a literary point of view, the ghost image is very powerful. Okay? And it actually allows the book to address a lot of issues that are kind of established literary issues. Right? So the idea of haunting, for example, is very powerful. All the way from the Gothic, you know, tradition to contemporary criticism, you know. But regardless, you know, this became kind of like a flashpoint. Another flashpoint is mixing up the Chinese mythology and just putting things down that would be laughable to somebody who knows about Chinese culture. Okay, so the prime example of that is the carving of words on the woman warrior's back. Okay, it actually came from a historical figure who's male. Okay, and he didn't get a whole page carved on his back. He got 4 characters carved on his back by his mother, you know, coming exhorting him to be patriotic and loyal and serve his country, you know. So that part, you know, definitely is taking something recognizable, okay, in traditional Chinese culture and exaggerating it and giving it a twist, right? Is that legitimate or not? Okay, so according to the critics, it's not. Okay, it's like making things up. And Frampton actually has a very funny parody of this episode. He made up a little story about Joan of Arc, who runs a French laundry in China. I mean, just like, you know, it's really funny, but it's just to give you a sense of how absurd it is to do this kind of twisting and distorting. Okay. On the other side, you know, people who defend Kingston would say, well, you have lots of Western writers who distort myths and kind of play with myths, right? Does anybody complain about James Joyce, James Joyce Ulysses, right? You know, in fact, you know, you're supposed to do your homework so that you understand what the deviations are and why the author makes them. So why are you not allowing a Chinese American writer the same right, you know, to play with imagery, to play with form, and also to play with legends and myths from supposedly from the culture. And then another line of criticism about Orientalism is Kingston is washing dirty linen in public because the West already has a really bad idea of, you know, the way Spivak puts it, like brown men, right, oppressing, you know, being very brutal and oppressing brown women, and then waiting for a white man to rescue them, right? So given that, Kingston actually should feel a sense of responsibility not to reinforce this idea. And when she complains about Chinese sexism and Chinese patriarchy, it's like aiding and abetting the enemy, you know, giving them more ammunition to criticize the ethnic community. So granted, I think in this book, she doesn't talk about white men rescuing yellow women. On the other hand, you know, just to bring it to the public, that in itself is a sort of appeal, you know, to basically the white American establishment. And from a kind of the colonial point of view, this is bad in itself. Okay? In Chinese, there's a phrase called bringing your grievances to foreigners. And that's a universally despised act. Okay? Came from an early period when, foreigners were very powerful in China. And, so sometimes if, you want an advantage, you actually bring a lawsuit or a grievance to a foreigner who would then override the Chinese authorities. And that's a form of colonialism. So the very fact that Kingston wrote in English and published in the US a book that talks about Chinese racism, Chinese sexism and patriarchy, that in itself is a form of bringing a grievance to the foreigner. And then last but not least, a lot of kind of imagery that could be interpreted as Orientalist. Okay, so definitely the White Tiger chapter. So you kind of misty mountains, right? And then you have immortals up in the mountains. You have dragons. You have people going up there to learn kung fu and Oriental wisdom, right? All these things. The mother, dispensing Oriental wisdom through talk story. I mean, these are all things that could be interpreted as so-called fooling the devil. Okay? And this again is a very Chinese American concept. It's something the cultural nationalists are very, very concerned about. So a long time then, because of the oppression of the early Chinese American immigrants, they would do everything to survive. And then, it's kind of like African Americans, having to live up to this kind of Uncle Tom image as a way to survive. Right? So as a sort of passive resistance, Chinese Americans would make things up to, so quote unquote, fool the devil. And I don't know if I believe all the stories that are told about that, but one story is that, the abalone shells, they're used for decoration. So supposedly way back, Chinese immigrants actually loved to eat abalone, and they didn't do anything with the shells, and then the white devils came along and said, what is this? And they just sold them, to the white devils and make money, and then that's a form of fooling the devil, So in the harshest critiques of the woman warriors, like the whole book is like a project to fool the devil, and then the devil bought it. Okay? So as I mentioned, I sort of jumped into the fray, on this point too, because it really upset me to hear these criticisms, way back in the late 70s and early 80s. But it also sort of upset me when I first read the book and found all the quote-unquote errors about Chinese culture, because I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I'm bicultural, biliterate. And I had to find a way to come answer to myself, like how do I come to a satisfactory way of feeling about the book that I can justify intellectually as well. So here I'm going to lay out like several ways to kind of answer the complaints about the Woman Warrior as a bad ethnic text, as a kind of sellout ethnic text. One is it is just expecting too much. It's unfair to put the burden of representativeness on one book. Okay? And the reason why Kingston's book was made to carry such a heavy burden was just because the American publishing industry had been so exclusionary. Okay? So hopefully then as more and more Asian Americans started publishing and having different voices, no single text would have to carry such a burden. And I think to some extent that has happened. Okay? So not that we don't have the flavor of the month issue, but it's kind of not as serious. I don't know, Brian, would you feel there's more of an opening for Asian American writers now and less burden on, say, you as a writer to represent the whole group?
I think I think that's right, and as a matter of fact, I think that, from the Asian American writers that I know, I think that part of the project was explicitly find ways to avoid that very thing.
I'm sorry, I'm looking for my Kleenex.
It's interesting that you, at that moment, you were talking about the criticism of like the whiteness having to come in and save the brown skin, because in my book, I purposely did not allow my heroine, my white heroine, to be able to rescue, precisely for that reason.
Right. Excuse me. Okay, and then on the issue of authenticity, I don't know, again, this is my sense, okay, and you know, you cannot tell me whether my sense is well founded or not. But I think the idea of authenticity is a little passé nowadays. You know, on this point, I want to bring in a pair of concepts from Edward Said that I found very useful in thinking about it. So Said makes a distinction between origin and beginning. Okay, so origin is something that is fixed. You can only have one origin. Is sacred. Is timeless. Okay. And then beginning is historical. Beginning is something that people make. Okay? And it exists in history, it exists in time, and is not sacred. Okay? It just bears historical meaning, but it's not sacred. And if you think about the whole controversy whether Kingston is authentic enough, I think there's an underlying assumption, you know, on the critics' part that the Chinese origin is sacred. Okay, and if you deviate from it, you're wrong. You know, you've sinned against your culture. Whereas if you think about the Asian American movement, right, it actually is premised on beginning, because you're saying, well, once you have left the country of origin, and now you're making your home, you know, in a different place, which is America. Then you have a new beginning, you have a new tradition, you have to have new heroes, right? And you can talk about different subject matter. So origin should not be determinative, right? So in a sense, you know, the cultural national critics are kind of contradicting themselves. On the one hand, appealing to the idea of origin and saying, you're wrong, okay? And then also claiming the right to create their own beginning in this country, you know. So I think you could look at it that way. But if you're interested in origin, actually a book just came out called Mulan's Legend and Legacy in China and the United States. And this one has historical research on, quote-unquote, the original stories of Mulan. Okay? And of course now you have like the cartoon version and all kinds of things. In China you have actually a movie version. I was thinking about showing you an excerpt, but it's not a very good movie, so I gave up on the idea. But what's really interesting is that, like, if you want to go to this to try to get a definitive answer about what the Moon Warrior story was, you won't find one, because even in China there are different versions. Okay, so definitely, you know, Kingston made up a lot of things. I mean, in the Chinese Moon Warrior stories, you know, she never gets pregnant. I mean, it's like just physically impossible as well, you know, that type of thing, right? And yet, you know, there's really, like, if you really do your homework, if you do your research, I mean, the very idea that you could go back to Chinese culture in order to justify what you do as a Chinese American writer, that just kind of completely falls apart. And I think also in another kind of context, you can think of the idea of authenticity as being a little passé, okay, because we actually live in an age of infinite copies of things, right? So it's not just like mechanical reproduction, okay, but we have digitization. You have simulacra. You have just kind of virtue this and virtue that, So to that extent, I think in general, like if you poll somebody, today, they probably not think of authenticity as something that's very important. I could be wrong though, because I also know that at the same time with globalization, you have a lot of local movements that try to go back and restore authenticity, and preserve authenticity. So these are just my thoughts. I'd love to discuss this with you, whether writers no longer need to be concerned with authenticity, okay? And they're kind of free to mix and match, right? Fusion, that type of thing. And then, so I was talking about the ethnic text part, right? And then I want to go on to talk about the feminist part. Okay, so with the feminist features of the woman warrior, they actually speak to many themes that were important to second wave feminism, Anglo-American criticism. Okay, so a central one is actually the matrilineal tradition, mother-daughter relationship, and people have done like extensive studies, of mother-daughter relationships, both from kind of psychological, psychoanalytic point of view, and also as a cultural phenomenon, right? And then traditions of mother-daughter texts within American literature coming out of, white women, women of different ethnicities, and then, it's almost like a specialty, to have mother-daughter texts. And of course, within the Asian American literary tradition, that's become almost like a cliche. It's still happening, right? Obviously, you have the woman warrior, you have Java Club, you have numerous other ones. The latest one is called A Thread of Sky, okay, which is about 3 generations of Chinese American women. So it's like going on and on and on. So this one fits perfectly, right, into the Anglo-American interest in mother-daughter relationships and creating like a heroic matrilineal tradition. So a lot of African American women writers also do that. Okay? So the protest against sexism, protest against patriarchy, right? The idea of female empowerment, all these would make it popular. Okay? But would it make the memoir so popular? This is what I'm looking at. There are a lot of women publishing, right? So if this book made it so big, would there be kind of like additional factors to promote it as a kind of quintessential feminist text? Okay, and I'll get to the interactions part, and then finally. As a postmodernist text, now this is your province, Tom. What I'm looking at mostly is because of the postmodernist features, it actually appeals to readers who think of postmodernism as being kind of aesthetically more interesting or formally more advanced and less backward, because it's not linear, right? And so on. And in a way, kind of aesthetically more, quote unquote, respectable in the academy. Okay? So, because of these features, what you see is English departments became very comfortable in adopting this book and promoting this book. It's like saying, okay, here's something that we are not ashamed to teach. But if you give me Fifth Chinese Daughter by J. Snow Wong, it's too simple. party though, father-in-law's descendant, you know, these are all just like, these are from the 40s and 50s, okay? That actually sold quite well, you know, got quite a bit of public attention and never got into the academy this way, okay? So you do have the postmodernist features kind of helping the book gain entree into the academic establishment because of certain academic fashions, you know, that are popular now. Sometimes it gets presented in the form of aesthetic merit, which is a term that I'm very suspicious of, okay, because there are tons of linear narratives that have a lot of aesthetic merit as well, right? So I prefer the term aesthetic interest in the sense that you can do a lot of things with it. And of course, you know, in your typical English department, right, close reading is still taught, you know, you need to be able to, as a teacher, you need to be able to use the book in class, you need to discuss things in class, right? You need to analyze things, you need to assign paper topics and so on. And The Woman Warrior is a kind of book that's amenable, that actually lends itself very well, you know, to this kind of institutional use, right? So the postmodernist features, you know, the fragmentation, right, the fluid, you know, narrative, right, non-linear, and you know, the kind of what I call the epistemological uncertainty of the storytelling, right? This is true, but maybe that is true too, you know, that type of postmodernist idea. These are all things that are capable of generating classes, okay? Therefore supporting the publishing industry, right? It can generate this whole, you know, cottage industry of, you know, theses and dissertations and conference papers and, you know, articles and journals and books and so on, right? So you know, there's this aspect of it, you know, which is...
But you talk about that as if it were a bad thing.
No, I'm just amused. It's really these features that help make an ethnic text kind of absorbable, you know, because there are other interesting ethnic texts as well, but, you know, those are the ones that, at least within the Chinese American tradition, I can't think of anything else that does this kind of complexity as well, okay? So, so it has that kind of potential, right? Yeah, it has a cachet, it has the potential to be incorporated into these kind of more hegemonic institutions. So the English department definitely is much more powerful than the ethnic studies department. So if you can gain entry into that, okay, you get a foothold, okay, and there's a good chance that it will be perpetuated, right? Let's see. Okay, and then I think relatedly, you know, within women's studies, you know, the time that The Woman Warrior came out was also when Anglo-American feminist criticism is engaged in a kind of self-reflexive self-critique and saying, okay, we are actually coming from like white middle class women's points of view, and we actually need to incorporate, you know, women of color experiences. And so this is where, again, you know, The Woman Warrior had an advantage because then, you know, it was very capable of multiple analyses. It was open to multiple analyses. And it's by a woman of color. This woman of color has quote-unquote good credentials, right? Working class background, you know, growing up in this out-of-the-way, you know, place like Stockton, Chinatown, okay? In a sense, kind of like fitting into the American experience of immigrant success, you know, going to UC Berkeley and then, you know, becoming a teacher, becoming a writer, that type of thing. So then it gained a foothold in that sense as well. And then interestingly, the postmodernist features also provide a way for me, okay, at least, to answer the question, like, if it contains all these quote-unquote inaccuracies, okay, and this is a term that we can debate, but you know what I'm talking about, that deviations, and all this potential for reinforcing stereotypes, is it still a valid text for me? And I had to answer myself, especially after the Joy Luck Club came out, which I hated. It's like, okay, if I like The Woman Warrior, but I don't like the Joy Luck Club, and they are both about very similar subject matter, but how would I justify it to myself? Okay, so I had to try to answer this question, and my answer is The Woman Warrior is self-questioning, and that's actually one of the kind of modernist features, right? You can never tell whether something is stated for sure. I can repeat the examples of that. When you tell the story of the lonely woman, you have one version, right? It's not prefaced by, I think, It begins with, the white, that's the other chapter. The lonely woman, you have a description as if this were true until you find another version of how this ant became pregnant, okay? And then you found another version. With the white tigers chapter, you begin with, afraid. It's like, okay, I imagine this, and then afterwards the narrative just turns into a description, no framing. Okay? With at the Western Palace, right? It reads like a self-contained short story about something that happened until you realize that, the author's imagining, the narrator's imagining of what must have happened in Los Angeles. Okay? Or, did the mother cut her tongue so that she could speak better? Or is it something that she made up, right? So there's constant questioning of whether something really happened. And also, right from the beginning, the opening chapter, right? Chinese Americans, how do you know this? These are not movies. How much is your own life and how much are the movies, right? Movies being master narratives that God inscribed in you, that you have internalized. And then like a major project of postmodernism is precisely to question these master narratives and to deconstruct them and to show that they were actually made up, right? Historically, they were created in a certain way, and you don't have to be tied to them. So in that sense, then, you have a way to answer the cultural nationalist critics, because they are reading the book as if it were a document, as if it were a sociological fact or history. And in fact, the book is doing something completely different. Okay? So that part, I can kind of safely explain to myself. Okay? And including the items that are probably wrong. I think probably Kingston made a mistake on some of the things and then afterwards said, oh, I deliberately, changed it. Yeah, sometimes I couldn't tell, right? But even these I could accept under this idea of the postmodernism project. Because basically she is saying, I am a Chinese American, I am removed from the so-called origin, and therefore I have to constantly reconstruct, what Chinese culture means to me, and I cannot be trusted. Okay? So to that extent, I am exempt, from this kind of criticism, because that's what I'm trying to do as a Chinese American. Okay? So that's fine, but in contrast, I think with Amy Tan, the reason why she bothers me so much is that even though she herself doesn't know too much about Chinese culture, she presents herself as an interpreter and an informant about Chinese culture. And when she goes wrong, she's very ridiculous. Okay. Like I wrote an article called Sugar Sisterhood, which is based on Amy Tan's, which book was it? The second book, Kitchen God's Way. Where there's a point, you know, like the narrator talks about being very close to her sugar sister. It's actually based on a homonym, you know, Tong Jie, which actually doesn't, that Tong is not sugar, okay? It refers to the daughter of your father's brothers, and what would that make it in English? No.
The daughter of your father's brother
Yeah.
is your cousin.
Cousin, right?
First cousin, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
First cousin.
Yeah. So, but it sounds the same as sugar, and she says sugar, my sugar sister. And not only that, but she kind of elaborates on it. It's like we're really sweet to each other or whatever, you know. And that to me kind of is typical of Amy Tan's approach, that she really does play up the idea that, like, I'm an epic writer, I am privy to a lot of kind of like Chinese secrets that you don't know about, and I will interpret it for you. I'll be the cultural ambassador and explain that to you. To the point now, when I see any Chinese American book with a title secret, I'm not going to look at it. There are 100 secret senses, and now you have Lisa C. You have
Her latest book?
Yeah.
Yeah, I forget the name.
Something fan snow.
Yeah.
You know, whatever. Yeah, but this is how I explain to myself, you know. This is in the declarative mode, not in the interrogative mode. I think the whole Kingston book is in the interrogative mode. And because of that, I can accept a lot of things. But if you just declare, it's like, this is what Chinese culture is like, and let me tell you, you know, because I'm bicultural, you know, that bothers me. So this is how I explain that. Okay. Now, given all this though, you know, there's also another dimension that you have to look at to explain the canonization of the Wu warrior. And that is, it came out at a time when the American Academy is trying to open up its canon. Okay? And the entire country is talking about multiculturalism. Okay? So that's how it actually became an integral part of American literature. Okay? Let's see, let me find the place. Okay, so in the 80s, actually, the United States was really embroiled in a debate about what kind of country this is, what is American culture, right? So on the one hand, you have books coming out on like cultural literacy, you know, basically like a laundry list of all the things that you're supposed to know as a good American. Okay? And of course, immediately you have cries about bias. You know, these are things that, you know, European Americans are supposed to know, right? But there's tons of other things that, you know, if you're coming from a different background, you should also know as a culturally literate person. So you have this kind of project. You have kind of overall attempt to dictate. You go back to the great books, go back to Western civilization requirements, so that we'll have a common basis, you know, for the identity of this country. And then on the other hand, you know, the movement to open up the canon, right, to have a more diverse faculty, a more Oh, okay, here goes. Sorry. Okay, I hope it's not an emergency. Hello? Oh, hi, is there a problem? Sorry.
That's good.
Oh, okay. Could you borrow a pen? Okay, yeah, I'm in the middle of the lecture, so why don't I get it quickly? No, that's fine. Oh, if it's just a few numbers, that's fine. Uh-huh.
Lisa C is a currently
Okay,
very
thank you.
popular
Okay, if there's a problem, call me.
Asian American writer. And if you look at me and you think you cannot see Chinese in me, and you see her photograph, she's got red hair, very white skin, and yet and that doesn't exclude her from the possibility of being an authentic, with quotes around that, Asian American writer, but it feels like she's trying very, very, very hard to like be authentic. I'm talking about Lisa C.
Oh, yeah, uh-huh.
I mean, you could just feel the sweat pouring out of her. Yeah, I promise you I'm Asian. Yeah.
Right. No, that's actually another kind of big context to look at, which is, you know, do you have to have the, you know, this increased racial mixing, right? So when you classify writers as Asian American, do you have to resort to like what quantum? Like who qualifies, right? Yeah. And that's actually kind of like taking diversity to the extreme too. You know, the whole idea of including different groups, you know, until the group boundaries dissolve, right? Where was I? Okay, so, sorry.
Making canon more multicultural.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you need a more diverse student body, right? So a lot of debates about whether there's some kind of hidden admission quota against Asians, just like there used to be a hidden quota, and also a hidden quota against Jewish students entering the universities, right? And then, should we change the curriculum so that you have material that's quote unquote more relevant for minorities? Okay, you should change the composition of the faculty as well, you know, so that people will be able to see role models, you know, up there on the podium. It's not always, you know, the dominant group teaching about your group, but you have kind of representatives from your group. Again, I mean, each of these ideas can be pushed to the limit, and then something happens. Okay? These are very difficult to maintain boundaries. Okay? But regardless, that was the atmosphere at the time. There was the kind of cultural controversies floating around the whole country at the time. So then, you know, if you include the woman warrior, it's an actually very economical way to answer whoever criticizes you for being exclusive or being too white or whatever, because you have a female writer, and you also have a Chinese American writer, and you also have a working class writer. It's like, you know, not just a 2-for, but you know, you can kill 3 birds with 1 stone, you know, right? So.
Can I actually add one thing to that?
Sure.
I think this is a great book, but I also think that another factor that gets things canonized is are there excerptable sections? Can you teach a piece of it instead of having to teach the whole book? And this book became that much more commonly used because, for instance, in freshman composition classes, they would not teach the whole book, but they would teach No Name Woman. So it was extremely useful in the constructing of syllabi from that point of view as well, I think.
Hey, this is really interesting. I never thought it's true. right? You have to be able to just take something out, you know, and that actually gives it like a wider audience.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have this theory that with other canonical writers in the contemporary, you have to have a big fat book that people can write dissertations on, and then a little book that you can teach in a 16-week term. And then if you have both, you're much more likely to get canonized. And I got this partly from listening to you about the multiple uses.
Yeah, you know, yeah, I was going to talk about this later, but this is a perfect point to bring it up. Okay, so the woman warrior got very popular, used to be taught in colleges, it's trickled down to high schools now. Okay, so if you think in terms of the English department as an institution to produce kind of certifiable experts, if you just use the woman warrior as your book for the reading list, for the qualifying exam, whatever, after a certain point it's no longer enough, okay? Because it's too widespread. It doesn't give you expert status. And if you go to conferences with a paper on the woman warrior, at one point it will get you a job in English as the Asian American expert. And then after a while, because it's gotten so canonized, it's no longer enough. In fact, before I retired, I started advising my doctoral students, like, don't present on the woman warrior, you know, or don't use it as your job, what do you call it, the sample chapter when you apply for a job, because it's too common now. You can't distinguish yourself. Now, in the meantime, you know, I think in the 90s, another Asian American woman's text got canonized. And it is by a Korean American writer. Her name is Teresa Hakun Cha. And the book is called Dictate, D-I-C-T-E. And this one is, if anything, more postmodernist than the woman warrior. Okay, it's very fascinating. It has pictures, you know, it has excerpts from historical documents, and it's really a pastiche. It's a collage of different things, multiple voices. Okay, a lot of historical references, but not in linear form. You know, so whatever the woman warrior has, Dictate also has, but to an even higher degree, and it's much more difficult to read. Okay, the narrative element is minimal. Okay. So that actually became the kind of touchstone text for the literary establishment in the academy now. So to be an expert on Asian American literature, you can't just do the woman warrior, you have to do Dictate. And that is something kind of recognized because, again, of all these features that are very amenable to the kind of criticism that English department people do. Okay, yeah. So you have this kind of situation where it's almost being a victim of your own success. You know, the woman warrior having once enjoyed this canonized status, then gradually trickled down and became something else. You know, but in any case, you know, what I want to bring out is that, you know, given all these issues about, you know, being the ethnic text, being the feminist text, the postmodernist text, all these together and then combined with this kind of historical moment where the United States is open to diversification and open to multiculturalism, then, you know, the woman warrior actually fit in very well. Right? Go ahead.
Are you about to move to the national text?
Yeah, should we take a break?
Let's take a break.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
let's try to be back by about 11:30, please. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, and I also like my.
Because it's very, you have to be very careful. Yeah. No, at all.
Okay, we're late getting back.
As long as it's
Yeah.
I don't have to do it like it because it's academic sense.
Okay.
Oh.
We drink a lot of coffee together. I brought 10.
Quickly, please. Okay, so we have reached the point of the Woman Warrior as national text.
Okay, almost there.
Almost there.
Okay,
Okay.
so, okay, so far I've talked about the ethnic and then the feminist and the postmodernist dimensions. Now, I at the beginning I mentioned, there actually might be conflict between them. So definitely between the ethnic and the feminist part I've already talked about, right? Another, you can kind of approach the issue from a different angle. Like think about an alternative text and why it didn't make it that way, right? So among Kingston's works, actually Tripmaster Monkey is a pretty major work. It is also very much like a history of Asian Americans in a way. It has a lot of references to the 60s and the early 70s, which is when the Asian American movement was taking place, or the counterculture was taking place. It has these, almost like inside jokes, about Asian American culture. It has a kind of ambition, almost like Ulysses. It's like, it's encyclopedic in scope, and you almost need to kind of annotate the book page by page, to get a lot out of it. It's really like a magnum opus, right? So if it's just a matter of finding a kind of representative ethnic text, why not this one? But I think partly because it's about the protagonist is a man. The protagonist is actually based on Frank Chin. It's almost a very sweet tribute to Frank Chin. But then if you have a text like that, it doesn't have the advantage, of an overtly feminist text like Woman Warrior, because that would give you more of an entree, right? I'd say, okay, this is an ethnic work, and then it does this that fits into our critical practice. Okay, so even though the content is actually also very anti-sexist and is very anti-patriarchal too, it doesn't work out. Okay? And then if you look at Chinaman, Kingston's next book, again, I think the similarities are even more striking. In fact, at the beginning, Kingston wanted to write like one book, okay, and then split her project into like a men's book and then a women's book. So starting with the women's book, which is The Woman Warrior. So you can see like the material is very, very similar. You have also performance features. You have the narration that is unreliable, right, and kind of self-contradictory. You have the Chinese American immigrant history. You have a lot of the same anti-racist concerns and parables and Chinese myths and things like that. And at the beginning, when it came out, actually, it also won awards in the US and it sold quite well. And then it kind of leveled off. Okay? So then the question is like, why? Okay, like why did this one book become a phenomenon and then this other one is kind of like, not exactly fashion pen, but it didn't have that kind of staying power. And one scholar has tried to explain that, Rachel Lee of UCLA. She said it's because race is more quote unquote unspeakable than gender in this country. Okay? So that's why after a while, you know, when the dust is settled, you know, after the book first came out, then Chinaman became a book that is mostly taught in ethnic studies because we do have an emphasis on race, whereas the woman warrior is embraced by women's studies because it is not so directly confrontational about race. Okay? So if you look at if you look at Chinaman, you know, there's kind of a much more in-your-face engagement with discrimination. Right? There's a whole chapter on the, you know, anti-Chinese laws. Right? You know, the stories about the emasculation of Chinese American men and so on. That, you know, given the kind of cultural configuration of the United States, excuse me, and given the establishment of women's studies as an institution, and then its particular emphases and preferences and concerns, then somehow, you know, Chinaman hasn't been able to attain that kind of status. Okay? So that's another instance where you have kind of some tension between the two ways of reading text and two types of statuses. And then between, say, ethnicity and postmodernism, that's actually, you know, kind of a pretty common concern, you know, is that who reads this, okay? If you really want to reach the members of your own community, why not write something much more accessible, you know? Now, you have kind of similar controversies in African American literature as well, you know. So with Beloved, you know, there's this famous example, right, of some people criticizing Beloved for being too obscure and kind of difficult to process, difficult to understand. And Toni Morrison said, you know, I taught this book in a prison once, and these were like prisoners, a lot of them not very well educated and so on. They got the book right away. Because you're not talking about just formal features of postmodernism. There's a reason people came up with this kind of fragmentation, right? And so, you know, you again have like, if not conflict, at least tension, you know, between these different types of practices. Okay, but regardless, you know, then okay, now you have the woman warrior attaining the status of a national text. Could I have more light? I'm sorry. Is it okay to open the blinds?
Yeah,
Or-
They were open, somehow they got closed.
Yeah.
Here we go. That good?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, all right? So if a book kind of made its name as an ethnic text, among other things, when does ethnic turn into national? And here I want to borrow a concept from John Guillory, who wrote about canonization. And he made a very interesting point that when you have these ethnic texts, and say they are, you know, excluded texts, they're not actually excluded. They have been included as a representative of the excluded. This is kind of paradoxical, right? You can't say these are excluded writers or excluded literatures, you know. Or rather, you hope that you can't say that because you have this one thing. You can call it token, but basically the inclusion is to signify exclusion. Okay, so on that basis, then the woman warrior has become a national text. To the point that, if you're teaching modern American literature at all, right, you have to teach it, basically. Okay? And I find it very interesting too, right? So, in these seminars, you basically have a government-funded project, to present American literature. And I understand that you actually didn't experience a lot of, any interference on what you choose to do, right? But regardless, then when American literature becomes presented to the world, then this Chinese American text becomes a part of it. In which case, then, how much of the kind of local Chinese American flavor and meaning would remain, and how much will it get kind of folded into a more general, broader idea of American literature? So there's one thing to ask, right? Because especially if you don't have a whole lot of time and energy and institutional space, and you just have this big thing to cover, and this is one of the texts, how much attention can you actually pay to the kind of specific features, And then in addition, when you have an ethnic American text crossing national boundaries, now, as a national text, you go to other countries. Okay, so now you are moving, you're traveling. Okay. Can you avoid carrying the kind of prestige and power of the American nation, and then influencing other cultures from that standpoint? Okay. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Not yet.
Okay, not yet. Okay. So for example, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I attended a conference in Germany about postmodernism, and I presented a paper on Kingston. And a Turkish German woman, young woman in the audience, came up and said, this book really, really touched me. It was very inspiring for me because as a minority, Turkish minority in Germany, I experienced a lot of the same things that Kingston wrote about. Okay? But then a couple of days later, like Kingston herself did a reading and engaged in a discussion, and she said something that was not what this Turkish German woman expected in terms of quote-unquote political correctness. Okay? She said something very disturbing to this young woman, and she got very disappointed. Okay? So in a way then, abroad, you have somebody kind of seeking parallels, between herself and the situation depicted in Moon Warrior, and also probably the kind of trajectory of the book, being successful and being heard, finding an audience, finding a foothold, and looking to that as an example. I'm sorry. And so, is it possible to completely avoid this idea of an American text serving as a teaching function abroad? It's like teaching you to be free, or teaching you to seek your destiny, inspiring you to be different, or something like that. And I'll quote you another example too, which is from China. Okay, so years ago, when China first opened up to the rest of the world, I read an article in an American journal in English, written by a Chinese, female Chinese professor. And she confessed when she first read The Woman Warrior, she didn't like it, right, because of all the reasons that we talked about. But then she said, but now I realized that all these lessons about female empowerment, I can actually take home, and I'll bring these up to my students. So there's another kind of example where you have a teaching function of the American national text, being taken abroad and then being presented as almost like kind of a new, gentler kind of face of the American nation, and then serving certain types of functions there. Okay? So I don't know whether it's something that in your own scholarly life or teaching life, whether these are issues that you run into. But I'm very interested in this, very curious about this. Okay?
So would you say then that part of the question is, I'm hearing two problems with this. One is a certain kind of paternalism that comes with the American text becoming a lesson text. And the other is a certain kind of nationalist function that is unintended. That is, that you become the representative of America in a way that you didn't mean to be.
Right.
You were trying to represent something to America, and now you're representing
And
America
what you
itself.
represent within the country is actually different from what you represent outside the country.
Right.
Again, I think if you try to contrast this with Jade Snow Wong's Fifth Chinese Daughter, it would be interesting because, as I mentioned, this book was very popular, and then the State Department actually paid for a grand tour by Jade Snow Wong to Asia. And the purpose basically was to say, look, we are not a racist country. We are a place where a Chinese American girl could actually succeed. Okay, and this is very much a part of the post-war American mission. It had a problem, right? And it was still having a problem with race, meaning with black people. But then, after the war, it became this superpower which represented freedom, was head of the free world and all these things. And so having a text like Jade Snow Wong's book would be very useful, to spread this image of America as being very open, and non-discriminatory, non-racist, and so on, So with regard to the woman warrior, within the U.S., there's talk about oppression of minorities and this and that, right? But in a way, this aspect would be either kind of downplayed or kind of folded into this larger project of representing contemporary America. Okay? So obviously, I'm not saying there's a conscious, deliberate, conspiracy of propaganda. Okay, so it's completely, even without your confirmation, I think it makes complete sense for the government not to have any direct say in this. But this is the way ideology works as well. It doesn't need to be manipulated by individuals, but there's a certain presentation that comes across, in a particular historical context, and maybe so. This is one of the things happening. Yeah.
Two things. One, you're about to lose your battery.
Oh, okay, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other is, it has occurred to me, I just want to reflect for a moment because you raised the issue so interestingly. It has occurred to me to think about my own function as part of the ideological machinery. And I have one, and I do recognize that. I refuse to sort of hew to the party line about American culture. But one of the things that expresses is, in American culture, you don't have to hew to the party line, and the government will still support you or allow you to do your work or whatever.
And so this is how we're different from all these other terrible governments.
Right, exactly. Another thing is, just by trying to be a nice guy, I am communicating to people from around the world. Americans are really nice people. They're not what you think based on our foreign policy. They're, you know, fundamentally sort of decent human beings who want to get along with you. And I think that's true, but I also think it's ideological. And I understand that in a certain way, even though I would not do this project if the government did not allow me academic freedom to do it, you know, to create the program that I think is important to create. But even so, I'm still a part of the machinery, and they would not fund me if I weren't. You know, they would not fund this project if it really did not have a positive function. Now, I think the positive function that it has is by and large not too pernicious. It does foster a certain kind of understanding of the place that is perhaps more complex than the stereotypes and so forth, and I think that's good. But let's face it, the U.S. government would not be paying for this project if they didn't see a benefit from a governmental perspective.
And the criteria for funding would actually change, you know, over time, right? So conceivably there will be circumstances under which your application would not get funded.
It could change, yeah.
Right, it could change, right?
Yeah. And there are certainly ways in which it could change that would make me not participate.
Right, or in an older version of this kind of project, then, you know, the reading list would be very different,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let me tell you, let me talk about a book, you know, very briefly to make my next point, okay? There's a book called Talking to High Monks in the Snow. Talking to High Monks in the Snow. It's by a third-generation Japanese-American writer. Her name is Lilia Minatoya, Minatoya, Lilia Minatoya, Minatoya. So this is a memoir that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, I don't remember. But anyway, it's a memoir about a Japanese-American woman and her journey to Japan. Okay, so she's third generation, she actually never, like, it's not returning to Japan, it's actually visiting Japan for the first time. Okay? And she was very disgruntled in the US. She grew up feeling racism. Okay? And at some point in her young adult life, she got unhappy enough, she decided to just kind of wrap everything up and be adventurous and go visit, you know, her ancestral home, you know, in Japan. And also on the same journey, she started going to other Asian places. At some point, she taught English in China and so on. And so the memoir is about that. And what's really interesting about this book is that while she experienced the minority experience in the US, you know, she suffered discrimination, you know, felt out of place and so on. The further she traveled, then the more American she felt. Yeah. So she first went to teach English in Okinawa, you know, teaching English to American soldiers there. And that, you know, was the first time she began feeling like I am not a minority American, I'm not hyphenated American, I'm not Japanese American, I'm just American. Okay? And then, you know, on various journeys, you know, so back in the ancestral home, right, you know, like obviously, you know, there'd be cultural differences, and then she felt very, very American. But interestingly, by the end of the book, she kind of talked like a very patriotic mainstream American, you know. And so I just want to, you know, kind of briefly refer to that, you know, to talk about this kind of disjuncture, right, kind of minority status at home and then kind of majority national, you know, representative status abroad. And related to that, I want to talk about some of my own experiences being an Asian American scholar presenting abroad. So I would go to these international conferences. Okay? And I would hear from scholars from other countries, coming up to talk to me after the paper or over dinner or something, and saying, we are behind you, by 10 years, or we're behind you by 5 years, or whatever, and we need to catch up with you, okay, meaning the lack of development in Asian American studies. And something about this phrasing, this statement, really bothered me, okay? Because I thought, now you're making me, again, this kind of like American teacher. I'm here to tell you what minority literary studies is like in your country. And then, I'm setting an example, and then you can learn from me. So then I began thinking a lot about this issue, like what happens, with this whole critical practice. Can you export it? Can you export Asian American literary studies? Or will it turn into something else? So that would be the next part of my presentation. So the national and the international are very closely related, right? And in a way, in this case, you don't even know you're national until you have done this international traveling, Okay, so I have a case study to look at. Since I can read Chinese, I began reading criticism produced in the Chinese language in the People's Republic of China. And I did that, and I focused on that rather than on Chinese criticism produced in Taiwan, because I know that in Taiwan, a lot of the scholars in this field were actually educated in the US. So actually the critical method was very familiar to me, but I was curious about what happened in China. But granted, this was like up to 2004, so since then, probably I have to ask you, what the latest developments are. So I wanted to find out whether there's a different critical practice, something that's more than just borrowing from Asian American literary studies here. And I had some interesting findings. So first of all, look at the overall differences, right, between Asian American criticism on Maxine Hong Kingston and then Chinese criticism on Maxine Hong Kingston. So in the one case, of course, English is the dominant language in the US. It's not yet an official national language, right? But a lot of states are trying to make it the official state language, or English only. Whereas in China, okay, English is very popular, a lot of people are studying English, but it's still a foreign language, right? So what it means is that a book like Kingston's, if it's taught in English, will be taught in a foreign language department. Okay, and then with the feminist aspect of it, right, you have a lot of women studies, gender studies, places in the US to study the woman warrior. But the numbers are much more limited in China. Okay, Chinese are still a minority. I mean, it's gaining in influence, but it's still a numerical minority in the United States. Sorry. But in China, the Han Chinese, Okay, there are a lot of minorities in China as well, but if you're looking at the Han Chinese, which is the dominant group, it's the majority. So just looking at these very broad differences, you can expect there will be differences in the way the woman warrior is studied, right? Unless, of course, you have scholars who study here and then they decided to become wholesale, transport the critical practice there, right? So I found a number of interesting things in my study of the Chinese case. Okay? So one is, when I started, I expected there to be a lot of Chinese scholars writing about Chinese references in the woman warrior, because there are a lot of allusions to myths and legends and history and things like that, right? And I was surprised that, yes, I did find some, but not as many as I expected. Okay? I thought it would become a familiar, topic and would be easy entree into things and criticism. But of course, if you think about it, it makes sense. It makes complete sense, because these are things that are all familiar to people brought up in Chinese culture. Whereas, like, if you're a scholar in the U.S., it's your asset. You'll be able to kind of make a name for yourself just by explaining very, might be very basic Chinese things, right? This is the way names are formed, right? So, okay, you look at brave orchid, moon orchid, okay, you explain that, well, in Chinese culture, usually the name is made up of 3 characters. One is your surname, and then you have one word which is shared between siblings, and then you have a third word which is different, Just by doing that, you would be a kind of novelty, right? And you'd be instructional to a lot of people, okay? So that function is missing, when you look at Chinese language criticism. Okay? And then the second difference that I found that fascinated me is this whole idea of cultural difference. Okay? Now, in the US, there's a very widely circulated idea. It's gotten to the point of being kind of cultural common sense, or cultural doxa, The idea is that if you immigrate from, quote unquote, the old country, you go through this whole process of, confronting the new place, new culture, right? So you have conflict, you have cultural conflict, and eventually you try to overcome this conflict, and then you get assimilated. That's the trajectory that is kind of presumed for all immigrants. And of course, a lot of critics have pointed out this was based on the European model. There are a lot of people of color immigrants, from Asia, Latin America, whatever, they actually don't fit, because at some point they're stuck as kind of permanent aliens. Okay? Now, still, it's a very powerful idea, and people growing up here, going through the educational system, going through kind of like socialization, would absorb it, and it's typically in the form of generational conflict. It's saying, well, because I came here, my parents are backward, they have all these old values that don't apply anymore. I am a forward-looking American. I have to break free of this culture in order, to have a future. And I get reborn as an American, right? This kind of old American, mythology of reinventing yourself in the U.S. and then becoming a new man, right? A new person. Now, this idea is anathema to cultural nationalists, and I was influenced by them. And my reason for not liking this idea of cultural conflict is that it's too simplistic. It actually assumes that whatever happens before your immigration doesn't matter. It's like it should be a blank. Once you enter the United States, put all that behind you, right? And then you are a different person. It also assumes this kind of timeline, right? That outside the US, is backward, it's traditional. And then here we represent progress, in the future, we are modern. And this is actually getting more and more untenable, right? Because I think America has become third world in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's only by kind of remaining ignorant that you can still think of yourself as representing the future and modernity, whatever, But in any case, something that students that I taught constantly expressed, and it comes up all the time in criticism. It's just an assumption that cultural differences, is inevitable, and it's something that you have to overcome as an ethnic person, so that eventually you have to drop, you can drop your hyphen and you become a full American. This kind of idea. Class differences sometimes get presented as cultural differences, right? So if you come from a family where people, say your parents dress quote unquote weird, and meaning, it's something that you get ashamed of, not mainstream. It may not be because of culture. It may be because your family is poor, you just kind of get, things on sale, whatever, right? So there are all kinds of problems with this idea of generational/cultural conflict. And we, as Asian American scholars, spend a lot of time deconstructing this idea of cultural difference. But when I read the Chinese criticism, lo and behold, the critics actually often believed in the reality of cultural differences. It's not a contested idea. In fact, it's kind of assumed that there are inherent kind of essentialist differences between Chinese culture and Western culture. So that really piqued my interest. Like, why? Right? And I think in this case, it's because the lessons, that Chinese critics try to draw from the Kingston case are different from the lessons that we as Asian American scholars try to draw. Okay? My concern, a lot of my colleagues' concerns, are to undermine kind of American hegemonic ideas. But for the Chinese critics, a lot of them are concerned about China's place in the world in the era of globalization. Right? And they have their own kind of particular anxieties. The anxiety is that, okay, now that China is becoming more powerful, right, more wealthy, it really wants to get a key role in the world, on the world stage. Right? So when China was able to enter the WTO, there was like widespread celebrations, all over the country. It's like a symbol of China being, accepted into, this world of globalization, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of anxiety about what will happen to us, our identity as Chinese. And so, looking at the woman warrior, a lot of these critics are willing to overlook all the differences that I pointed out before, right? Majority versus minority, foreign language versus native language. They would just overlook that and pick out the fact that you have a character who's going through what is perceived as kind of classic cultural conflict, but not Chinese Americans. It's broad, it's really, really broad. It's Chinese and Western. So America becomes kind of broadened into the West, because that's the way you look at things from within the nation. You know what I mean? Like, you're here, there's a boundary, and you look out, and that's the rest of the world. So the West, could be broken down to American, America, Europe, whatever. But at this point, for this particular concern, it doesn't matter because it's Chinese Western differences. And so the lesson is to borrow from the narrator, okay, how she tries to overcome cultural differences, how she tries to eventually translate, and reconcile herself with her ancestry, right, in the person of her mother. And in this kind of reading framework, kind of internal differences in the US don't matter. So for example, there are racial issues in the country, in the Woman Warrior, right? So the narrator talks about engaging in like civil rights activities, in the 60s, trying to basically ally herself with African Americans, okay? Friendship between the little girl, Maxine, and the little black girl, right? There are all these racial issues, the narrator talking about urban redevelopment and how it destroyed, basically it's white government, right, destroying her community. All these things would be leveled. They would actually not gain the attention of Chinese language critics writing in China, okay? Because they're basically kind of borrowing and applying this American text for their own use. How much time should I stop now?
15 minutes.
Okay,
Total.
is there time for Q&A? Or?
Well, we'd like to have some time for Q&A. The session is supposed to end in 15 minutes. If
Okay.
we end in 20, it's not going to kill us.
Well, maybe I should go on for another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, sorry, there's more stuff to talk about, but okay, I would like to leave some time for discussion. So, I look at this phenomenon and came up with a term for it, which is the proxy text. Okay, so the text is a proxy for you to think about issues that are close to you, that are relevant to you in your discursive location and in your own kind of social, political, economic situation. Now, there are different degrees of proxiness, like different degrees to which you use this foreign text as a way to contemplate your own issues. So you could do it very crudely, okay? And, kind of ignore, subtleties. Or you could actually become an expert on this and you know about it, but it doesn't prevent you, your expert knowledge doesn't prevent you from also applying lessons, that you find in this proxy text. Okay? Another example, from another country, this is just something that I heard about. When I got interested in this, I asked a Polish-American postdoctoral fellow who was visiting Berkeley to help me look up some information on reception of the Woman Warrior in Poland. And so she did some research and she wrote back to me and she said, "I'm sorry, you must be very disappointed, but I only found this, review, okay? And the review actually talks about something that would really upset you. So basically the review is about how this Chinese-American woman's text gives you a glimpse of what it's like to be free and to enter the modern age, and leave behind kind of corrupt old world. I mean, of course, when the postdoc was, taking my course, we talked a lot about deconstructing the American myths of cultural difference and so on, right? And so she thought I would be very upset to see this. But I said, no, but it kind of precisely proves my point that when the text travels, you cannot import the attendant critical practice or pedagogical practice overseas. it will turn into something else. So it's really probably a matter of degree, right? So for a book reviewer in a magazine or in a journal, maybe for him, all these nuances and subtleties and details probably don't matter. You want to use it because this was actually a time in Poland, right? It was really trying to reinvent itself. Okay, so you can't borrow the book that way. So China then will be borrowing the book, in its own way. Now, if it's a matter of degree, is there a degree beyond which I don't think you should go? Okay, and that for me was reached when I read some Chinese criticism saying that the Woman Warrior, like other Chinese American texts written in English, are basically a subset of Chinese literature. Okay, so because now that China is powerful, it's like a big magnet. Okay, it's trying to show that what is happening in the diaspora is really like part of the Chinese people's achievement. So the achievements in the diaspora, it doesn't matter what their self-identification is. It doesn't matter if they say they're Chinese American or Chinese Canadian or Chinese Filipino, whatever. But whatever achievements they have, as long as they make it, this will redound, to the glory and the prestige of the Chinese people and the Chinese nation. And this is where I would draw the line. I actually got very upset because it's like saying that your Chinese American experience doesn't matter at all. Okay, and this is by scholars too. Okay, it's not by, say, a book reviewer kind of casually talking about the book and trying to sell it or promote it, but it's by scholars. Okay, so I will stop here. I have a lot more to talk about in terms of what it means to be world literature and so on, but we are out of time. So I would love to hear from you. Like just kind of surrounding the issues that I raised, whatever you observations, criticism, comments, that would be welcome.
Okay, thank you for your valuable comments on this novel. What I like particularly is the idea of being a stranger in one's homeland.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, this is kind of a double immigration, right? It's like a Tunisian guy going to France and then coming back after many years, and he feels a stranger in his own, if you like, country. Mm-hmm. And what makes things much more difficult, I mean, I'm talking about writing here, is whether we consider this novel to be made in China, if you like, or made in America. I mean,
right.
What makes this novel Chinese, if you like? You talked about this book as a subset of Chinese literature,
right.
Organically linked to the to Chinese literary output.
Yeah.
Right.
But you reject that notion.
I reject that, but it's actually like it's a huge claim. It's a very interesting claim because it's like saying it doesn't matter how you grew up, it doesn't matter what kind of place you grew up in or live in, it doesn't matter even what language you write in. So if you are a Chinese writer, Francophone Chinese writer, of which there are some famous ones in France and in Quebec, right? Or if you're Anglophone Chinese writer in Canada or the US or something, or in Malaysia, doesn't matter. This is all this is all these are branches of Chinese literature.
Yeah, I think the question is, I mean, Kingston should have introduced American characters within the book. This is the point I couldn't, understand quite well. I mean, she should have included some American writers within this novel, and then, in this case, creating possibilities of dialogue and interaction between, characters belonging to different, if you like, races. And then we see conflicts and tensions coming up, coming out of these interactions. This is what I really found strange about this book.
She does that in Tripmaster Monkey.
Yeah, which I
You know,
didn't read.
right. But I think, see, the point of this book is really like the isolation of the Chinese Americans at that point in history, right? Being in Stockton, you know, Chinatown, running a laundry. So the isolation and lack of direct interaction with basically mainstream American characters is what you're referring to, right? That's the whole point. That's why they're ghosts, right? So white teachers will be ghosts and they're not real to her.
Can you identify really quickly what you mean by American?
You mean white?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, which are two different things.
Yeah, white. Yes.
Yeah, like I mentioned, they're black characters too, you know, like very few, right? But you do have that within, because that was the socioeconomic environment. You know, like just from being working class, you'd be more in touch with black Americans than with white Americans. You know?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Is this novel mainly for American readers or for Chinese readers?
Oh, for American readers, I mean, it's obvious.
Written in English, so mainly for American readers.
Right, I think probably in her mind she would specifically like to address Chinese Americans, which is there on, is it the first page or second page, right? So a direct question, Chinese Americans, you know.
So one of the purpose of the writing is to bring Chinese culture to American readers.
I am not sure. I'm not sure about that. But of course, this is the way it's read now, you know, by a lot of Chinese critics. Like she has this mission to promote Chinese culture. And again, this is like to the extent that she's part of the Asian American movement. I mean, she doesn't fully identify with it, but to the extent that she's part of that movement, you know, she would consider that really to be Orientalist. You know, like it's something that the Chinese cultural aspects of the book are probably more engaging to, say, white readers than to fellow Asian American readers. You know, now somebody like Frank Chin, you know, who's kind of, he claims to be her sworn enemy, right? Like he himself would categorically reject this idea that Chinese Americans should preserve and also promote Chinese culture. You know, and I think there's a generational difference as well. I think first generation Chinese Americans don't mind. You know, they love it. They love talking to people about Chinese New Year, you know, Chinese cooking and such. And then American-born Chinese hate the idea. I mean, just, you know, it gets on the nerves to be asked to read some Chinese calligraphy, right? And then interestingly, in the global context, now that there are a lot of kind of direct cultural imports from China, and China is, you know, trying to come up with this, trying to extend its cultural influence in the world. You know, I saw something very interesting. It's like I saw a Kung Fu, I saw a show, you know, based on Shaolin Kung Fu. Okay. Kind of extravaganza, right? You have music, you have, you know, a lot of fancy costumes and Chinese martial arts. And then a character, you know, representing the emperor walked out on the stage, and he looks exactly like Fu Manchu, okay? And as a Chinese American, I was like, oh my God, you know, Fu Manchu. How can you sell Fu Manchu? You know, you're Chinese. But then it occurred to me, so first of all, it may be true that Chinese Americans, just from being a minority, you know, are very, very guarded, very defensive about stereotyping, right? And China, just from coming from this majority, you know, and coming from a country they feel to be increasingly powerful, they don't mind. It's like whatever makes the show popular, you know, they will not avoid stereotypes just because they may be taken wrong, okay? And so, you know, you can interpret it cynically, but you can also say because of shifting balance of power you know, at this point in history, you know, the concerns would be very different from the Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. You know. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Got one more question. That is, nowadays diaspora study, the study of diaspora writing and writers
Right.
very popular.
Yeah.
And what kind of Chinese writer could be called diaspora writer, which is American-born Chinese or those born in China then traveled or immigrant to America?
Right.
What kind of Chinese writer can be called diaspora writer?
Scholars don't agree on that. Okay. Now, my understanding of